welcome to Global 360, the webcast produced by the Washington Diplomat, which has been the premier source of information for DC's diplomatic community for over 25 years now. I am the managing editor, Anna Gawel, and I want to introduce my esteemed co-host, political analyst, Eric Ham. Hello, Eric.
Hi, Anna, and welcome, everyone. So good to have all of you with us today for this very exciting webcast that we're having today. So good to be with you.
Thank you. And so we also want to thank our sponsor, Sahori Insurance, which has been serving the diplomatic community for over 50 years, as well as Cigna, an American health services company that operates all around the globe. And of course, we want to thank everyone who has been able to join us today. We have had several webcasts before, which you can view online on our website, washdiplomat.com. But this is our very first live webcast, so we apologize for any errors. And if I make any flubs, you're just not going to hear them and completely ignore them. But so let's go ahead. We have a lot to delve into. And obviously, Eric, 2020, unfortunately, seems to be the year that just keeps on giving. Unfortunately, in terms of bad
Not
news.
In a good way, right?
No. It does give us a lot to talk about, but that's not what we want.
Right.
So we want to let the listeners know, originally, Eric and I, when we were discussing the ideas of what we wanted to do, we wanted, obviously, this webcast to be focused on long-term threats. So things such as climate change, which is often mentioned, and pandemics, which for a long time has been kind of one of those things that's considered long-term, but not immediate. So only now are we paying a lot of attention to it. But among the issues that we were going to include was white nationalism, which is on the rise both here in the US and also abroad, namely in Europe. And of course, we focus so much on 9/11 in terms of counterterrorism. But the FBI and other agencies have long been warning about the fact that white nationalism is on the rise. And we've seen it with attacks on houses of worship. We've seen in the massive attack that occurred in New Zealand. And, you know, this relates to yet another kind of long-term issue, which is the rise of populism, both here and in Europe. And we've seen that in particular fueled by inequality, which has been going on for years, for well over a decade. And so we see a lot of these long-term issues. And of course, this overlaps with racial inequality and racial tensions. Now, these have percolated under the surface and at times emerged. And now, of course, at the moment, we are seeing it explode with the death of George Floyd, a 46-year-old African-American man in Minneapolis who died after a white police officer knelt on his neck for over 8 minutes. We've seen the protests that have consumed the country at the moment and have even spread across the globe. And so, of course, the current events related to George Floyd have overtaken our discussion. But I think what's important is it's actually made it more relevant than ever because it kind of fits this pattern of important, long-standing issues, obviously taking a back seat to the more immediate news cycle that takes place. And we've seen this with climate change. We've seen this with, hurricanes Harvey, Maria, where a crisis occurs, we talk about it, and then it tends to fade. And of course, we've seen this as well with Black Lives Matter, whether it's Trayvon Martin or Michael Brown. It comes up, it tends to fade, and now we are seeing it again come out into the national consciousness. And I think what's interesting is this time around, the frustrations have really been compounded by other factors, such as, complaints that the Trump presidency has been very divisive. Social media, yet another long-term issue and tweets that have potentially incited the violence. And of course, the coronavirus pandemic, which has revealed and exacerbated racial inequalities in terms of medical access. So we're seeing all of this, and I think it's a perfect storm of events. And I think I wanted to make a few personal observations because before we really delve into things, it's been It's obviously, and I'm sure Eric, you agree, it's been a shame to see these kind of two extremes, which on the one hand, we have seen looting and violence, and that in and of itself is a complex phenomenon because you certainly have people of all colors who are simply capitalizing on the chaos to steal things, to put it bluntly. There's also well-documented reports of outside agitators who are coming in trying to smear the campaign. There are protesters also who have genuine grievances, who feel that is the only way that they can be heard. So, which unfortunately is as most people will say, counterproductive because it tarnishes the cause. It hurts local businesses that are already have been so hurt by the coronavirus pandemic. Then on the flip side, we have seen disturbing images of police officials firing tear gas, rubber bullets at peaceful protesters in front of Lafayette Square to clear the square out yesterday in order for President Trump to do what many considered simply a photo op in front of St. John's Episcopal Church. And, I think what's interesting is on these two sides, you have criticism. On the one hand, you have the bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, who called President Trump's appearance deeply offensive. On the flip side, you have George Floyd's brother, Terrence, who has also criticized and denounced the looting and the virus and instead urged people to go out and vote to air their grievances. And I think my own observation here is it's a shame that these two extremes have obscured the fact that the majority of protests have been peaceful and have represented people of all backgrounds. And I can say personally, in my own neighborhood here in Maryland, I was driving home the other day and there was a few dozen protesters who had blocked the road. They had been sitting there for several hours. Police were simply diverting traffic. Obviously, emotional tensions were high, but there was communication among the police and the protesters. And at the end of the day, what was so remarkable was the protesters knelt down in solidarity with George Floyd, and the policemen joined them in kneeling down on the ground. So I think it's important to keep these stories in mind, not just for the fact that they counteract what we're seeing, the images that we're seeing, but also because this gets to what would ultimately be one of the solutions in this long-term issue of addressing racial tensions, which is that it's going to require a dialogue among the police and the African-American community, the community at large, really. And these are the kind of solutions where they're not glamorous, they're not immediate, they're certainly not easy, but they are essential to addressing these kind of deep-seated problems. And I think that parallel can be applied to all kinds of issues, whether it's climate change, white nationalism, tech disruptions, and so forth. Solutions are not easy, they are not fast, and I think that's something we have to keep in mind when this current news cycle will inevitably shift at some point. So those are some of my thoughts. Eric, let's throw it over to you. And what are some of your thoughts on everything that's been taking place over the last week?
It's interesting because we're talking about some of the major national security threats. And typically what we see every year is a threat assessment that looks at what are some of the issues that perhaps are pressing or things that we need to be concerned about. And there are three that are actually on this list this year that I think we're looking at or have the potential to really impact the United States and also have a global impact. And we're seeing them play out right now. One is, of course, this rise in white nationalism. And we're seeing that right now. In fact, we have heard from the FBI that has already said that in 2019, the majority of domestic terrorism arrests involved white nationalism. And in February of this year, the FBI announced that racist violence is now an equal priority to foreign terrorism. In fact, they equated domestic terrorism by white nationalists to the same threat level as that of ISIS. And here we are, I'm in Washington, D.C., not more than 10 minutes away from the White House, the epicenter of political power. And you're seeing all of this play out right now. I'm hearing sirens just outside my window, police helicopters flying around from the chaos that the nation's capital, much like the rest of the country and the rest of the world, has been watching for the last 6 days. And so that's playing out right now in the country. And also, I think what plays into that is this notion of attacks on the truth, because as you mentioned, Anna, there are people who are legitimately protesting, but within those protests, we do know, based on our reporting, that extremists are also involved in these demonstrations and protests, which is why we're seeing the violence, the looting, buildings being burned down, places being looted, because there are people who are peacefully protesting. There are people who are rightfully outraged and frustrated and grieving and filled with pain. But also there are people who are taking advantage of these opportunities to foment chaos and discord. And so the question is, how do we discern what is the truth, what is real, and what is not? And I think that is what our national leaders are grappling with, are coming to grips with, because right now it's almost like there's infiltration, it's guerrilla warfare, because you don't know who is a peaceful protester, who is a peaceful demonstrator, versus those that are attempting to cause carnage and destruction. And so what this national security threat assessment actually lays out, we're seeing that in many instances play out right before our very eyes. And the world is watching and wondering, is the United States, which, we often look at as that shining city on the hill, but over the last 6 days, it's been very difficult to discern the United States from a third world country, right, that could be in chaos and turmoil, because the United States looks very much like that. And last night was no different when you saw peaceful protesters being pushed out of an area so the president of the United States could have a photo op. I mean, that's something that, we typically don't see take place in this country, but it's playing out much like what many people see as a concern for the vulnerability that these potential threats have on the country.
Right. And, of course, it's so relevant that you mentioned that this is not a national issue. It's an international issue. And we're seeing that with protests that are being held abroad in solidarity. We've seen it in London, in Germany, even New Zealand. But on the flip side, we have also seen a lot of authoritarian governments take advantage of this to denounce the U.S. and point out that, the U.S. might lecture on human rights, but they feel it's hypocritical. We've seen an interesting tweet from China. When China was criticized, they responded simply with, "I can't breathe." We have had Russia, the Russian government, talking about the lack of media freedoms, and of course, there have been, I don't want to say attacks, but the media have been swept up in the backlash with police. But of course, at the same time, coming from Russia, where media is arrested and cannot air free speech, it's a bit rich coming from that. But there are certainly countries that are taking advantage of it. We've seen Iran as well, pointing out that U.S. sanctions have hurt their people as well, which that is a legitimate debate to have, because sanctions have hurt average people in Iran. But at the same time, you have to remember that this is coming from a country where last year, reportedly, thousands of protesters were killed, but we don't know that because those protests were censored. So, it's a very complex picture where, at least in the US, you are getting a picture of that. And then, Eric, you mentioned social media. And I think what's been interesting locally, there's been a hashtag that has gone viral, hashtag DC Blackout. And this is, a quintessential example of how misinformation can go viral so quickly. Basically, this hashtag claimed that officials are blocking any kind of information coming out of DC in terms of people who are protesting and so forth, which have, you know, being somebody who's been on the scene is flat out false. You know, no social media accounts are being blocked by DC or federal officials, but instantly this hashtag went viral overnight, as did President Trump's tweets about, you know, when the looting begins, the shooting begins, and all of this, which is, you know, which people were concerned was going to simply incite more violence. And so again, this gets to a long-term issue of the role of social media, the role of the internet in terms of spreading false news and news that will incite people, incite violence, force them to question what is real and what is not. And this is simply going to be an issue. It exploded with the 2016 election. It is certainly only going to get worse with the 2020 election. And so again, as you said, all of this is interrelated and brings up enormous issues of freedom for, you know, online tech companies and social media. And these are enormous questions that we've been grappling with, and it's very difficult to get a handle on them. And these protests have exposed the dangers of it.
And, you know, one of the issues that is seen as a potential threat is this attacks on the truth, which is what you're talking about. And we've seen this in as these protests and demonstrations have been exploding across the country. We have seen President Donald Trump go to war with social media companies. And we have seen this back and forth between the president and Twitter. And just recently, we saw the president issue an executive order that looks at a section of the law, Section 230 of the Communications and Decency Act, which protects social media companies from facing lawsuits over what their users post. And we know now that the president wants that section of this law to be focused on by the Federal Communications Act. And what this is looking at and what we're seeing now is what is real, or being able to determine what is real and what isn't. We also have to go back to the Mueller probe, where Robert Mueller, the special counsel, indicted 12 Russians for hacking. And one of those issues that we know that they focused on was this issue of they focused on propaganda targeting African Americans. And so stoking racial flames, stoking racial unrest. And now that you see the country basically in flames, and many of many large American cities across the country, the issues now, again, is what is real, what is not real. And then, of course, we have an election in less than 6 months. And so also we have the president who is pushing back on this idea of mail-in ballots. So now you've got the president not only going to war with social media companies, but now the president is going to war with states that are opening up for Americans to simply mail in ballots, because again, the United States is now confronting a perfect storm, that perfect storm of pandemic outbreak with social unrest, and trying to keep its citizens safe. And one way to do that is keep them from going to the polls and allowing them to mail in ballots. But the president is now threatening to withhold resources, valuable resources, to the states that are, one, grappling with a pandemic, with an economy that is still reeling, and now with so much damage in many of these cities, and with police and fire already being stretched to the limit because of the pandemic outbreak. Now you've got gaping budget holes, and now you've got a president who is threatening to withhold additional resources to states because they are creating greater access, not limiting access, for Americans to actually enact in their most basic democratic principle, which is expressing themselves at the ballot box by simply mailing in a ballot. And now you're seeing the president now at war with many of these basic democratic principles.
And exactly, as you said, I mean, that could be, we talk about the news cycling, shifting gears. I mean, that the election obviously looms large. And in addition to foreign interference, you have where tweets questioning mail-in voting could fundamentally erode what could be perhaps another close election for all we know. And, as you mentioned, I mean, Trump's questioning or crackdown on social media companies, there's a certain irony to it because a huge part of his popularity has been fueled by Twitter. He has taken advantage of this new medium in ways that previous presidents have not been able to or have not done. And, if he were to revoke that 1996 law, his account would be one of the ones because of widely documented, false claims, that his account would be one of the ones that would be on the chopping block. But, again, this gets to so many other issues in terms of social media, as you said, so many that are connected. We have barely come out of, our time frame is so consumed by what's happening. But just remember, last year we had massive privacy breaches from the tech companies, and that was the headline of the day. And Congress struggled to address that issue because, Congress and many of us are not that familiar with how tech companies work. So, we're still behind on the curve in terms of addressing privacy issues, let alone fake news in terms of, all kinds of fake news, bots and foreign instigators and so forth. And so we have yet to really even address that. And now you're talking about the coronavirus pandemic, which is relying in part on the tech companies to help with apps that will help with contact tracing. But this brings a whole new Pandora's box of questions in terms of potential surveillance. I mean, especially in countries such as China and also here. So these are so many difficult questions that do seem to be converging all at once, and there's no immediate solution. And I think, I think you try to urge caution, but it's so difficult in such fast moving events. But, as I was saying, the news cycle will shift, and we do need to keep in mind that so many of these events are connected. As much as we want to question globalization, and there are legitimate questions about it, we cannot deny that so many of these issues overlap, and so many of these solutions will not be quick. They will be long-term, just like they are long-term threats. And unfortunately, we're seeing that in a very visceral way, aren't we?
We are. And I think one of the major observations of both this pandemic, where the United States has already lost more than 100,000 lives and more than 1 million people affected by the virus, and it's still happening. And of course, that's only going to get worse as we see so many people, not social distancing with all of these demonstrations that are taking place, but also with the demonstrations over continued racial inequality. And now with the pandemic that has also laid bare many of these inequalities. I think what the overarching theme is that we are seeing the United States perhaps at its most vulnerable state right now. And we're seeing the country being attacked both internally and externally, because again, this was a virus that came from the outside in, but also many of just the basic safeguards that many of us thought were in place or were there to keep the United States safe. Now, I think those are coming into question, and many are calling them into question, basically in terms of who are we to believe? Are we to believe the president who continues to rail against the media, calling them fake news, saying that the country is moving on, the virus is no longer a threat, although we see every day that it is based on the numbers that we're seeing. And so it's this basic issue of who do we believe, what is truth and what is propaganda. And I just want to read a quote from Sue Gordon, who until last year was a top intelligence official with the National Intelligence. And she said, "Trust and truth are the foundations of free and open societies." And right now, that trust is clearly broken. And the truth, we simply don't know where to go and who to blame in terms of what the truth is. In fact, we can't determine what the truth is based on watching what our own eyes are showing us in terms of protests and demonstrations. And so clearly, the United States is increasingly vulnerable. And now more than ever, I think the work of our national leaders has gotten increasingly more difficult, because once you lose trust and truth, it's so difficult to get that back.
Right. Well, I just want to say that to our viewers, you can trust in us. We have the truth.
Oh, yes.
We're the truth tellers, so there's no hashtag fake news over here. We do want to apologize. There have been some technical glitches. If you would love to see our lovely faces, you can go on our Facebook page, just like Washington Diplomat, and you can actually see this live stream. But we appreciate every viewer who has stuck with us. We're still ironing out the glitches. That's, yet another long-term phenomenon of all of this social media tech world transition. We're all transitioning to Zoom and all of that loveliness. But to get on a somewhat of a lighter note, at the end of each webcast, we talk a little bit about a segment that we call Cultural Corner. And I want to include it in this one, even though we've talked about some very heavy topics, because I think we all need, Eric, as you know, a bit of a break from the news. Even though we're engulfed in it, we all need a bit of a break. So,
absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm going to mention a few things. And again, you can go on our website, watchdiplomat.com, and we're going to have more details on everything. We're going to have links. You can go on our Facebook page. That will show you this discussion. You can see our wonderful faces. But anyway, on to the cultural things, which are, again, very reflective, not just of the pandemic in terms of going online. Now the topics that a lot of the cultural organizations are tackling deal directly with the pandemic. So I think that's really interesting. So I'll mention a few. Arena Stage is launching a new supper club that will present 2 films, including the premiere on June 12th of a film called, don't mix up the dates, May 22nd, 2020. And that's a docudrama that captures one day in the life of the DC region. So it features all kinds of people of a variety of backgrounds, from a climate change activist to a grandmother living on her own. And what I did was 10 playwrights interviewed all of these subjects and created monologues based on those interviews that offer a window into how the coronavirus pandemic has radically altered the lives of people in the nation's capital. So I think that would be a great thing to check out. Also, kind of a bit of a random event, but please do check it out. On June 4th, the Italian Embassy and the Italian Cultural Institute is hosting a Zoom webinar called The Art of Healing. So it will talk about how historically women artists from Florence used art to help people who are dealing with illness, because they believed that art had the power to heal the mind and the body, and certainly, serve as a distraction from all of the bad things happening. So that's an interesting connection, historical connection to what's happening now. And then, of course, Eric, as I mentioned, sometimes you just need a break from all the pandemic stuff, all of the protests, which is understandable and it's healthy for us. So on that front, I want to recommend 2 outlets. The Kennedy Center just released its full lineup of digital programming that offers an entire slate of quote unquote couch concerts from groups such as the National Symphony Orchestra. And there will be other events like the Yo-Yo Mo show, I'm trying not to mess that up, an evening of musical doodling, which will be a whole lot of fun for kids who are still cooped up inside the house. And finally, the Capital Riverfront Business Improvement District is taking its popular Friday night concert series online throughout the month of June. So in addition to these 1-hour concerts that will be streamed every Friday at 7 p.m. on Facebook, there will also be a free virtual fitness series with yoga on Sundays at 9, Pilates on Tuesdays at 6, and dance on Thursdays at 6. So you can get all of the details again. We'll be updating our website, watchdiplomat.com. And I think we all need not just a break from the news, but some activities and exercise at home, because at the moment, really, our own personal health and well-being is something that's easy to overlook, but very important to maintain. And so again, on that note, actually, we are next Tuesday, we will fix all of our glitches, and we're going to have a very interesting conversation with Dr. Peter Mills, who is based in Britain and is with Cigna. And he is going to talk to us about the all-important topic of maintaining our health and well-being in this time of not just pandemic, but turbulence worldwide. And then he'll also talk about some of practical advice, because we are beginning to reopen. So he will talk about what tips and things we need to keep in mind as we return to the office. And then, being a medically trained doctor, what we can expect in terms of a possible vaccine on the horizon. So that's going to be next Tuesday at 11 o'clock. We'll have information on our website. And we will have more programs on ambassador interviews, and we will get to some of the long-term threats that we didn't even get to touch on today, but that, Eric, as you know, unfortunately will give us plenty of topics to talk about in the future. So I want to, of course, again, thank our sponsors, Sahori and Cigna. I want to thank Eric for all of your amazing insights. And thank you, everyone who has joined us, bared with us for this live broadcast. We're going to have more. And please, in the meantime, stay safe and please stay tuned so that you can stay informed. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.